Let's go for it. Okay. Well, look, everybody, you're all very, very welcome this evening to be joining Bart and myself and our two fantastic speakers for this, I think, very special event. Let me just start by introducing myself. So my name is Nick Macklon. I'm the medical director at London Women's Clinic here in central London, but I'm wearing my other hat tonight as co-chief editor of RBMO, which I look after together with Juan Garcia Velasco, the other chief editor, and of course our fantastic team of editors and section editors and all the office people who I'm sure you all interact with when you send your papers in. And this is one of a series of events that we've held on the i3 platform, very successful for the journal. It does allow us to reach out to our readers and our authors around the world to highlight particular topics of interest and provide a platform for some of our speakers to share their science with you. And we're very pleased to do that. As many of you know, RBMO is not linked to the SRM or ESHRE. It has its own history, having been found by Bob Edwards just over 25 years ago. Many of you may notice that we celebrated our silver anniversary last year. And the journal continues to be, I think, a strong global journal, differing in character from perhaps the other journals in our field, offering, we hope, new science, new ideas, but always rigorously presented and reviewed. And we're always very interested to receive your work to the journal. So that's a little bit about us. And the topic tonight is going to be a very special one. I'm going to ask my friend Bart Fauser to tell you a little bit about it, but let me introduce Bart. Not that he needs any introduction to you all. It's a great pleasure to be doing this event with Bart, an old friend, colleague, and mentor of mine from many years back, and also the previous chief editor of RBMO. So just to tell you a little bit about Bart. Bart is Professor Emeritus of Reproductive Medicine at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, where he's also chair of the Division of Obstetrics and Gynecology, having been professor in Rotterdam before that. He's held a whole series of international senior positions. He's currently serving as scientific director of the IFFS, the International Federation of Fertility Societies. He's a member of the US National Academy of Medicine, honorary fellow of ESHRE, honorary member of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and has had an incredibly distinguished research and teaching and mentoring and clinical career. So it's a great pleasure to have Bart with us. He has a particular interest in this topic, and Juan and I were delighted when he agreed to co-edit the special edition with us. So Bart, perhaps thanks very much for joining tonight and helping us present this to our audience. And perhaps you'd like to tell them a little bit about the topic.
All right. Thank you, Nick. A great pleasure to do this together with you, as always. Indeed, it feels like home, even for me, in the RBMO setting. Good day, dear colleagues and friends from all over the world. It's quite amazing. I'm counting and still increasing, but I see almost 400 attendees so far. So wonderful. I hope you're going to have a stimulating couple of 90 minutes presentations and discussion. Indeed, be most welcome to come with your questions, and it gives us food for thought and discussion after each of the lectures. And a little bit about fertility decrease. Indeed, via my function in the IFFS, I have been gaining interest in this area, and we published several papers, and fertility is declining. We know this, and now you read about it everywhere. In the eyes of many, that's good news. Because there has been so much scare about overpopulation of the planet and all the catastrophes that would go along with this. So many people still today see this as only positive. But things are changing. And we see, particularly in the more wealthy societies, that there are actually very few children being born, with many society implications. And although politicians usually say, oh, this is in the private domain, so we don't want to interfere, but on the other hand, slowly they are more and more interfering. So it's a topic with many different aspects. It's also a very sensitive topic. I've seen that on several occasions, particularly in the lay press, that people say, "Oh, you're only there to promote your own business, and you want to do more IVF cycles," or they say, or they think, "Who do you think you are to tell younger generation to have more children?" So, of course, it is not to intervene in any personal decisions, but it's about awareness, and it's about education. We still know that there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly amongst the younger generation. So there's much room for improvement there. It's also, for me, one of the key issues that addresses all this is family planning. We all know the term family planning, and in a way, at our school, when we were younger, family planning was being addressed, and this was very much focused on contraception, on preventing unwanted pregnancies. And now, with the eyes of today, you think about family planning is not just preventing pregnancy if you don't want it, but it should encompass the other side of the coin, which means that you can help facilitate people who would like to have children. So that is slowly emerging, that concept, again, despite much resistance. So how can we help younger people who would like to establish a family and now, for whatever reason, are unable to do so? And now there's more and more recent focus on what is referred to as the fertility gap. That actually it is not uncommon that people who do not have children would like to have had one, or who would like to have more than one child but don't succeed for whatever reasons. So all these aspects are going to be discussed in this RBMO special issue. And you see that the topic now is being addressed in all major journals, the fertility journals, but also in the more broader scope journals. So we, for RBMO, have tried to put together a very, very comprehensive set of papers, which we will publish in the special issue, and hope somewhere around ASHRAE, summer or a little bit earlier. It's altogether, it's about 13 different publications, with, again, all different aspects. So I think it's fair to say that it's probably going to be something unique, where we have such an in-depth and comprehensive coverage of this area. And it's not just about infertility, but it's predominantly about what do younger generation want and why, and what makes them decide to have children or not. So it's much broader than just infertility care, let alone IVF. So two of the ones who participating in this RBMO special issue have been invited today to participate, to speak about the topics that they have been working on and give a lot of consideration. So the first presenter, so let's focus on the title first: Declining Global Fertility and Our Future Dependence on Assisted Reproduction. And the presenter is Professor John Aitken, a very, very prominent reproductive biologist who've been working in this field for more than for a long, long time. And he has been working over the last 25 years at the University of Newcastle in New South Wales in Australia. And as a chair of the biology sciences, a director of ARC Centre of Excellence, and a pro-vice chancellor of the Faculty of Health. So he has published extensively in this area of fertility, predominantly on basic science aspects, but over the last couple of years, he has been published very profound data on decreasing fertility. So I think it's time to give the floor to you, John. There will be about 25 minute presentations, and thereafter time for questions. John, please welcome this evening, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to Nick for the invitation, and great pleasure to be part of this very important event. And very warm welcome, literally, from the east coast of Australia. I should begin with just a brief disclosure. I have, get my slides going. I am the director of a biotech company, but nothing I think I shall say today conflicts with that particular role. So this talk is about declining global fertility. And we don't have much time, so I'm going to cut to the chase. And this is the problem that we're dealing with. So historically, the average woman globally would have had around about 6 children, but beginning in about 1968, which was when Paul Ehrlich published his book about population explosion, fertility rates started to fall really quite dramatically. And they are now hovering just above a replacement level, which is set at 2.1, one child to replace mum, one child to replace dad, and 0.1 to account for infant mortality. So over the last half century, there's been quite a dramatic decline in global fertility rates. And in some countries, this has been really quite severe. So if you look at the tiger economies of Eastern Asia, Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, they all started in 1960 with fertility rates around about 5 to 6 children per woman. But they then very rapidly descended, and for the last half century, they have been below replacement level, and they have shown no sign of recovery during that period of time. And every year that goes by, the fertility rates decline a bit further. In Western democracies, we see exactly the same thing. So in the UK, USA, and Australia, again, starting at a slightly lower point, around about 3 to 4 children per woman in 1960, we rapidly descended to below replacement level and have been there for literally half a century now. And overall, the UN predicts that 183 of 195 countries will have fertility rates below replacement level by the end of the century. So this is quite a dramatic change in human fertility, and in a way is slightly counterintuitive, because most of us live in densely populated societies, and every second of every day we are reminded just how densely populated we are, whether it's finding a car parking space or trying to find enough money to buy a house. We live in very densely populated countries, and in these 3 countries, certainly population has increased over the last half century quite dramatically. And that, as I say, is kind of counterintuitive. How can fertility rates be falling and yet the population expanding? And the reason for that is that in the West, we have embraced multicultural societies, and we have welcomed large numbers of immigrants to our shores. So Australia, United Kingdom, United States, and all the countries in North America, Northern Europe, and Australasia have encouraged large numbers of immigrants to their shores. And that has enabled them, in a way, to paper over the cracks of their infertility. Whereas in the East, there isn't such a culture of welcoming immigrants, and even very large countries like China and also Taiwan, South Korea, Japan have very low immigration rates. So they don't have the opportunity to use immigration to recover their population numbers. And if it wasn't for immigration, UK, Australia, and the US would all be in negative population growth at the present time. China is a very interesting country demographically. They certainly showed the same decline that everybody else exhibited in the 1960s, with fertility rates falling from about 6 down to close to replacement level. And many people would think, well, that's just because of the one-child family policy. That was a government edict that really drove fertility decline in China because they were so worried about overpopulation. But in fact, the one-child family policy was introduced in 1980. So the fertility rates had already been falling quite dramatically before that point. And indeed, the Chinese population responded with a slight increase in fertility rates in response to that governmental edict. And then afterwards, they continued their decline and are now well below replacement level. That's not to say that the one-child family policy had no demographic impact. It certainly did, because the moment that policy was introduced, we saw a skewing of the sex ratio. It's begun to correct recently, but for about 30 years, the sex ratio in China was highly skewed towards males. And that has had a couple of major demographic consequences. So on the one hand, we now see that the number of females less than 14 years of age declined from the moment that policy was introduced. And this is important demographically, because the number of young girls in your society less than 14 years of age represents your population momentum. It tells you about the pool of people you have who are going to fuel your population growth in the years to come. China has a much diminished population momentum compared with countries like India, whose birth rates have fallen but have enormous numbers. 79 million girls under the age of 14 in India are going to ensure that that country continues to expand population-wise to become the most populous nation on earth in about 20 years' time. The other consequence of this falling fertility is, of course, that in China currently there are 30 million young men who will never find a female partner, and there's sort of epidemic of loneliness in that country. But more profoundly, because there is no population momentum, there is really no buffer between birth rate decline and population decline. And China's population has already started to decline, and the UN predicts that it will halve before the end of the century. And I don't think we have really contemplated the geopolitical and economic consequences of a halving of the Chinese population in the next half century or so. What are the Chinese doing about it? Well, it's very interesting that they are certainly turning to automation. If you don't have a workforce to maintain your productivity, the right thing to do is to start to automate. And they are by far the largest investors in automation in the world, much greater than the second nation, which is Japan. But they're both in the same territory. They're using automation to try to compensate for low levels of fertility and a shrinking workforce. There is a problem with that in terms of the economic cycle. In Western democracies, we have very dense populations. We have lots of immigrants. They move to the cities. They participate in the productivity of the country through the offices and factories that they work in. And for that service, we pay them a wage. We then take half the wage away in direct and indirect taxation. And one of the uses for that tax revenue is to support the swelling ranks of the elderly, because all of these societies have very large numbers of elderly people now. And the rest of the money is used for discretionary funding. They buy plasma TVs, they buy a house, they go for nice holidays in Cornwall. The trouble with robots is, on the whole, they don't pay taxes. They're not very interested in TV, and you hardly ever see them on holiday in Cornwall. So there is a structural problem there. If you become too reliant on automation, the circular economy collapses. So what China should be doing, and I'm sure it is, and many other countries are doing, is that, well, let's try to address this problem at source. What are the actual reasons that fertility rates are declining? And it turns out to be quite a complex issue, much more complex than you would have imagined. So the first thing, though, we can set aside is that this is not a Malthusian disaster. So as world fertility rates have fallen, actually our capacity to generate food, whether that's crops or livestock, has increased. Now, we all know that food can be weaponized, and certainly throughout the world, there are populations that are starving. But globally, we can't say that the decline in fertility rate was due to a lack of resources. We've been able to generate enough food to feed the population. Got nothing to do with food, but it has got something to do with prosperity. In the recent decades, we've seen fantastic growth of world prosperity in terms of GDP. And one of the things that happens when societies become more socioeconomically advanced is that they gain the knowledge and the facilities to address infant and childhood mortality. And as world GDP increased, so infant mortality and childhood mortality came down. And that had an immediate impact on fertility rates for very obvious reasons. If a couple are sure that all their children are going to survive, they make a quality over quantity decision and decide to invest most of their resources in raising 2 children rather than 7, because they don't need the 7 as a buffer against mortality anymore. So that's one of the key issues which has at least initiated the demographic transition. But there is something else much deeper which is happening in society, which is maintaining that transition and driving us down to these very low fertility rates. And that something else is something which actually started in the late 17th, early 18th century with a group of philosophers who initiated a movement which is loosely called the Enlightenment. And essentially, this is the doctrine of self-determination. It says, you shouldn't let political dogma, superstition, religious creed, or tradition determine your course through life. You should let reason and logic be your guide. All modern liberal democracies are based on those principles, and they are characterized by freedom, autonomy, and equality. And those properties have had an inadvertent impact on fertility, and particularly for women. So when fertility rates went down, women gained that most precious of all resource, which is time. And they've invested that time in seeking educational opportunities. And it's one of the great success stories, I think, for society over the last half century, is that we are now seeing half of the population, all the female population, in secondary education. But one of the things that happens when women become highly educated and start to seek professional careers is that their fertility rates start to fall. And that's particularly true with tertiary education. With tertiary education, fertility rates fall like a stone. And the reason for this is quite obvious. If you are addressing a lot of time, using a lot of time to gain educational qualifications and train for a profession, you are putting off your childbearing years. And and I don't need to tell you as an audience, are a very unusual species in this respect. All over the world, we are seeing maternal age at childbirth increasing, and this is having an impact on our biology because we stop reproducing in midlife. No other species, or very few other species, actually do that. So if you look at fecundity during the life course, women are at their most fecund when they're about 19 years of age. And then beginning at about 34 or 35, fecundity suddenly starts to be lost. And it follows this very precipitous decline and is all but gone by the early 40s. And this is a major issue for our species. And in a way, we are always fighting our biology. And this is something that Roger Short pointed out many, many years ago. If you look at a hunter-gatherer who is, if you like, living life as nature intended, the hunter-gatherer woman in the Kalahari will have her first child when she's 19 and a half, when she's at her most fertile. Life is then an alternating sequence of pregnancy and lactational amenorrhea. And the hunter-gatherer woman will stop reproducing in her early 30s. We are the complete opposite. We use largely contraception to have this very long period of cultural infertility. And in modern societies, it's not till you get to the age of 30 or so that you start to have children. And then there's just time to squeeze in 1.5 children before the portcullis of age-related infertility comes down. So in this sense, we are fighting our biology. And what do women do about it? Well, they do the obvious thing, which is to reach for IVF. But of course, IVF can be of limited help to you, because what IVF does is simply juxtaposition sperm and egg. And the problem for aging women is not that the sperm can't find the egg, but the egg is losing its developmental potential. So in IVF cycles, you see exactly the same decline in birth rates between the ages of 35 and 42 as you see in the naturally conceived population. And this point has been emphasized by some beautiful data released by the HFEA, which has looked at fertility rates in women of different ages. And it's a very great, I think, success story for the United Kingdom that in the optimal age group, we have seen fertility rates, pregnancy rates with IVF increase now, so they're around about 45% in women of the optimal age. But with every year that passes after that optimal age, you see that the pregnancy rates come down. And if you're over the age of 40, they become vanishingly small. In Australia and New Zealand, currently, I estimate there are over 20,000 women over the age of 40 in IVF programs who are very unlikely to go home with a baby. And I think this is the first of three major problems I will highlight for ART going forward. A second problem is we've already discussed maternal age is increasing, and much is at first conception, and much has been written about that topic. But paternal age is also increasing, and less consideration has been given to the impact of advancing paternal age on fertility and the health and well-being of children. What we do know is that as men age, there is a slight decline in pregnancy rate, not the precipitous decline you see in women, but it does decline. But something is happening to the quality of their gametes, because as men age, we see an increase in miscarriage rates, and we see quite a dramatic increase in the incidence of dominant genetic diseases like achondroplasia, Apert syndrome, and so on. The other thing that happens with men as they age is the DNA quality in their gametes begins to deteriorate, and you see more and more evidence of DNA damage in their spermatozoa. And this has an impact, not so much on fertility, but on the health and well-being of the offspring. So as men age, their sperm, which suffer from this DNA damage, and it is, as I'll show later on, oxidative DNA damage, they can still fertilize the egg, but unfortunately the oocytes of the aging female partner begin to lose their capacity to repair that DNA damage. And this creates a kind of perfect storm known as the oocyte collusion hypothesis, which results in that DNA damage becoming fixed as a mutation in the embryo. And that creates diseases, disorders in the offspring. So you see this chain of cause and effect. As men age, you see an increasing level of oxidative DNA damage in their sperm. As men age, you see an increase in the de novo mutation rate in their children. And as those mutational loads reach a certain level, you start to see diseases kick in. And the major ones are neuropsychiatric disorders like autism. The only problem I have with this chain of cause and effect is that the mutation rate is actually very low. It's only about 2 de novo mutations for every year of paternal age. And what are the chances that one of those 2 mutations is going to create a condition like autism in a genome that contains 3 billion base pairs? You'd have to think that was very low. And the only way you can explain this is if the DNA damage that's occurring in the spermatozoa is not random, but focused on some part of the genome. So we've looked into this and exposed cells, sperm cells, to oxidative stress, looked at the DNA damage, and by and large, the levels of oxidative DNA lesions correlate with the size of the chromosome. So really nothing to see here. The only exceptions are the sex chromosomes, which are somehow preserved from oxidative DNA damage, and we don't know how that's done. But there is one chromosome, chromosome 15, which is particularly vulnerable. And this is chromosome 15. And along the bottom here in the blue lines, we see the 8-oxoguanine residues. And you see that the damage is throughout the chromosome, but there is an area here where it's particularly intense. And interestingly enough, that region has been mapped to conditions like autism, bipolar disease, spontaneous schizophrenia, and Marfan syndrome. And all of these conditions, every single one, is correlated with the age of the father at the moment of conception. So as men age, bad things are happening to their gametes, and a consequence of that is that we see this increase in neuropsychiatric disorders in their offspring. Still mercifully rare, but nevertheless that increase is there. And if this is happening and the age of men in IVF programs is increasing, surely you'd expect to see an increase in the incidence of conditions like autism in IVF children. Well, this has been looked at. This was a study published in 2015 on 30,000 Californian children. And it showed that with IVF, actually, there was no increase in the incidence of autism above and beyond what you would expect from the naturally conceived population. But there was with ICSI. With ICSI, there was an increase in the rate of autism for, I think, the obvious reason that with IVF, you have some level of sperm selection at the level of the zona pellucida. But with ICSI, there is no selection. The sperm is just directly injected into the uroplasm. This has been quite a controversial finding, but recently a meta-analysis appeared, which shows that overall, there's about a 36% increased chance of a child developing autism if it's conceived by ICSI, not IVF. And this, with the widespread recourse to ICSI as the sort of dominant means of insemination, I think this is a problem for ART. And a third problem is an evolutionary one. So in Paleolithic times, the average woman, as we've already said, had 6 to 7 children. And they had 6 to 7 children because they knew that most of those children were going to die before they reached reproductive age. And this, in a way, created very intense selection pressure for fertility. As a couple, you had to be capable of having 6 or 7 children for 1 or 2 to survive and pass your genotype on into the next generation. You then fast forward through the demographic transition into the low fertility land that we currently occupy, and there is really no selection pressure on fertility, none. And as a consequence of that, you can, it's sure as night follows day, we will see a loss of high fertility genotypes from our population. If you don't select for something, you lose it. And then galloping over the hill comes IVF, and it didn't really matter when IVF was the cottage industry responsible for less than 1% of all new births. But in some countries now, in Australia, it's 7% of all births, and I think in Denmark it's 10% of all births. And wherever you look, the graph is inexorably upwards. And if IVF starts to account for 20, 30% of the population, then we have a perfect storm, because you have now no selection pressure on high fertility genes and technology which is ensuring that poor fertility genes remain within the population. So human fecundity is bound to fall under those circumstances. And the more that we use IVF in one generation, the more we are going to need it in the next. And there are important implications there for governments and National Health Service providers. So that's a third problem for ART. And then something I really don't have time to address, but we live in modern environments which are associated with lifestyles and environmental factors that affect our reproduction. And most of these things, age, toxicants, smoking, obesity, radiofrequency, electromagnetic radiation, diet, pro-inflammatory conditions of various kinds, all create oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is the enemy of reproduction and will reduce human fecundity. Oxidative stress will also incidentally reduce longevity, and this may explain this curious relationship between a man's semen quality and how long he actually lives. So to bring all that together, we now live in a society which has gone into what the demographers call lowest low fertility land, driven by socioeconomic factors, poor lifestyles, environmental pollution, and the indiscriminate use of art. We are now experiencing very, very low levels of fertility. But as Bart said, many people welcome this. It's good to see the population declining. Certainly climate change would be grateful for a reduction in the human population. And so, again, demographers have thought about this and thought, well, what is the optimal population size for our planet? And they said, well, maybe it's 2 or 3 billion. Well, whatever that number is, at that point, we somehow have to climb out of this area in order to stabilize our population. And if, as at present, 25% of women can't or don't want to have children, it means that the other 75% are going to have at least 3 children each for us to achieve that label of stability. And for reasons I've given, I don't think we can rely solely on ART to help us get there. So what does the future hold? Well, in preparation for the next talk, I think education is going to be very, very important. We need to think about the environmental and lifestyle changes that are needed to support fertility, and governments need to adopt pro-natalist policies that will encourage couples to have children. So it just remains for me to thank my colleagues with whom I've had very many long and detailed discussions, and in a shameless piece of self-promotion, tell you that I've written a book about this. It's published by Cambridge University Press and available through all good booksellers and probably some bad ones near you. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that really remarkable overview. So much to think about, and the questions are flooding in, and I hope you'll be able to stay with us to address some of them when we get onto the panel discussion. One question perhaps I can ask you before we move to the next speaker. This demographic transition, it seems to have started in the early 60s. And I just wonder, do you think, was the availability of the oral contraceptive pill something that kicked it off? And that fall, was it a fall down to the number of children women would prefer to have in a situation where they're not having to compensate for high perinatal mortality? And actually, we're perhaps being too optimistic in thinking with education, which we'll be hearing about from Adam, we can get up to having families of 3 again, because when women got the means to control their fecundability, they decided pretty rapidly to drop down the size of their families.
Yes, so 2 parts to that question. The first part is about contraception, and contraception is fascinating. So many people have written that contraception is responsible for the decline in fertility rates that we've seen. Well, it's not. It's not responsible for the decline in fertility rates that we've seen. There are many countries, Japan being one, where the contraceptive pill wasn't introduced until the 1990s, and yet fertility rates were falling. There are other countries like Albania where contraception was banned entirely, and yet fertility rates showed the same declines you see everywhere else. Contraception does not cause a fall in fertility rate, but it enables a decline in fertility rate. And it's exactly what you inferred, that women decide that they don't want to have large families because they have other things in life to pursue. Life is no longer about having a large family. It's about really self-realization, realizing your potential. And contraception helps them get there. And so that's the importance of contraception. Whether we can get back to where we were, I've said that this is going to be a big ask because we have gone through this philosophical change. As I said, procreation no longer the purpose of existence, and to suddenly convince every woman that she now has to have 3 children in order for our population to stabilize is going to be a big ask, I think, in the future. But we are going to have to do something. And I think education, as you point out, is one of the key things that we can do. I think as Bart intimated right at the beginning, sex education is kind of embedded in Victorian era. It's all about stopping having children. And I don't think people are really aware of just how fragile fertility really is. So better sex education would certainly be an important part of the equation going forward.
Great, thank you. They're really, really clear and sets the scene beautifully for our next speaker. So, John, for the moment, thank you very, very much. And we look forward to engaging in the discussion further with you later.
Great.
Thank you.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Adam Balen. Again, I think a very well-known global figure in our field. Adam is an NHS consultant. His day job in Leeds Teaching Hospitals in Yorkshire, and where he has a personal chair in reproductive medicine and surgery, and leads a huge clinical service there. Many people will know him perhaps best for the work he's done on polycystic ovary syndrome over the years, more recently contributing to international guidelines, both through the societies, but also through the WHO, and also helping to develop the IFGO definition of ovulatory disorders. So he's had a very wide and profound impact on how we view reproductive ill health. And therefore, I think with that background and also his involvement with the British Fertility Society as a former chair, leadership roles within the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. He really is in a superb position to give us his view as someone who's been really actively trying to assist in this process over the last few years, both in the UK and abroad, of the role of fertility education in addressing this perfect storm that John has just been telling us about. So, Adam, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nick, and hello, everybody from wherever you are around the world and whatever time it is. And Nick, thank you for that very kind and warm introduction, and Bart too for chairing this really important symposium, and John for setting the scene so beautifully with such profound and also worrying data. And you nicely led us into starting the discussion about the role of fertility education in addressing fertility rates. And I suppose I need to just start with some disclosures, but there are none that specifically conflict with this talk this evening. So fertility awareness has been defined as the understanding of reproduction, fecundity, fecundability, and related individual and non-individual risk factors, some of which we've already heard about, including societal and cultural influences that may affect reproductive planning and family building. And actually, a universal factor that has been consistently reported in the declining fertility rate globally is limited knowledge about fertility. And I will argue that it's not only amongst the population, but dare I say it, amongst us as healthcare professionals, maybe not in the field of infertility medicine, but healthcare professionals and educators and policymakers who have to consider this really important issue. So the need for fertility education really reflects these changes that we've been hearing, changes in patterns of family formation, including, importantly, delayed childbearing, and also increasing diversity in family structures, such as same-sex parenting, donor conception, surrogacy, transgender parenting, and also fertility preservation that we see expanding both for medical and also social reasons. So, as John mentioned, sex and relationship education in schools globally has been very poorly delivered. Historically, there's been an imperative to educate young people about safe sex, contraception, and consent to avoid sexually transmitted infections and unintended pregnancies. We've looked at this in detail in the UK, where sex and relationship education has been very variable, and a number of studies, and one of which I'll share with you, have illustrated huge gaps in the knowledge of young people about their reproductive health. And there has been very little mention about thinking about future family planning, that phrase that Bart coined at the beginning. So family planning really should be about when is the right time to start a family, and how can we empower our population and our young population with the knowledge so that they can make the right reproductive choices. And those of us working in the field of fertility all too often hear time and time again that when couples come to our clinics, they commonly express surprise that they may have left it too late. And as we've already heard, there's a demographic shift upwards in the age of first birth. We see this around the globe, and this is for many and complex reasons. And as John mentioned, the need and desire to develop careers and the huge socio-economic disadvantage there may be, and there certainly is for women in the UK who want to start a family when they're young. We also see a huge rise in the cost of housing, whether to rent or to buy, and so a tendency for young people to live with their parents for longer, and also evidence that there's a lack of commitment by young men to relationships and family building. And we've heard about the biological realities. I don't need to repeat it to this audience, and John has gone into this in some detail. And again, to emphasize that environmental factors are very important, both for fertility and for the health of a future child. And there are many mixed messages too, with older celebrities often hitting the headlines having children, but very possibly or even probably with donor eggs, and this often isn't mentioned. And also a perception that fertility treatment may work at any age, and John again has highlighted the HFEA data, and we see that this clearly isn't the case. And is egg freezing really an insurance for the future? Many of us would argue that it isn't. You'll be familiar with this study from Dick Habema from the Netherlands, published 10 years or so back, trying to answer the question, when is the best age to start trying for a family? Of course, it's very difficult to say, and many couples wish for a family of more than one child. And in this paper, it was suggested that for a 90% chance of having one child, it's okay to start trying when you're in your early 30s, maybe round about the age of 32. If you're prepared to consider IVF treatment, then you can delay by a few years and start in your mid-30s. But if you want a family of two, you should be considering starting at the age of 27, and women who wish a family of three should be starting in their early 20s. So this again feeds very clearly into the startling data that John was sharing with us. A few years ago, when I was chair of the British Fertility Society, together with the RCOG, we performed a survey of 1,000 young men and women between the ages of 16 to 24. And I'm just going to show you a few pieces of data from this publication. So this was to ascertain their general level of awareness of basic fertility issues, and others have published similar data. So the vast majority didn't have children. Most would want children in the future, and the majority thought that they would be trying by their mid to late 20s, but about a third waiting until their early 30s, and a small proportion waiting a little bit later. And the answers to the questions from males are in blue and from females in red in all of these slides. So when we asked at what age do you think women are most fertile, you can see the range in responses here, with some suggesting that maximum or optimum fertility is achieved in mid to late 30s or possibly even later. And when does fertility start to decline in women? Some respondents felt that fertility didn't even start to decline until the late 40s or even early 50s. So this shows quite a profound lack of knowledge or understanding about basic facts of human reproduction. And again, we asked questions about what factors might affect fertility in women. And whilst the greatest proportion did mention age, you can see this only reached about 60% of males and 80% of female respondents. I'm not going to read this list here, but it speaks for itself. And you can see that there was awareness about weight, general health, but being on the pill for too long was considered to be a factor by some, masturbation by others. And when factors that might affect fertility in men were asked about, again, you can see a range in answers, with, again, a sort of a spectrum of awareness of the factors that we know may have an impact, and some that probably don't have any impact at all. And when we asked about whether they had seen any information talked about fertility in the previous year, a few said that they had, but those that did, the majority got their information from the internet or social media, and only 20% from an official source. So this led us to hold a fertility health summit at the RCOG almost exactly 10 years ago. It was introduced by Alex Jones, who's a well-known TV producer in the UK, who at the age of 39 then was exploring her own fertility journey, and I was helping her with a documentary series that she was making on her own fertility. And because she was there, we consequently garnered a huge amount of publicity, most of it positive, some of it suggesting that we were being controversial, for example, suggesting that 3-year-olds should be taught about sex, which of course is not what we were saying, but this was all about introducing the notion of improving fertility knowledge and knowledge about general reproductive health at an in an age-appropriate fashion. Because the underlying philosophy that we were explaining was that the lack of reproductive knowledge may lead to many missing out on the opportunity to have children in the future, or for that matter, taking steps to safeguard their fertility. And from this summit, we developed and founded the Fertility Education Initiative, which was the first special interest group of the British Fertility Society, with an aim to ensure that people have a greater understanding and awareness of fertility and reproductive health, so that they can make an informed choice about their own fertility journey. We produced some animations which were designed and developed by Grace Dugdale, which are available online, exploring the basic fundamentals of fertility and also the shaping of modern families and recognizing the differences in family building. So these were the main aims: to understand human reproductive health, the basics of the reproductive life cycle, fertility and infertility, the preventable causes of fertility issues, and how to plan for a healthy pregnancy. The understanding of modern families with societal and cultural variations in family building and different routes to parenthood for different groups, whether heterosexual from the LGBTQ+ community and single people with or without fertility issues. And also how assisted conception techniques may work for family building, and also, if necessary, other routes to parenthood. And importantly, a basic understanding of reproductive technology, what it can do, and what also, as we've heard, what it may not be able to do. Shortly after this, the Department for Education in England produced a white paper on relationship and sex education. And we were key contributors to this paper, and I'm very proud to say that we were able to change the national curriculum in schools such that the new guidance includes the need to educate young people about the facts about reproductive health, including fertility and the potential impact of lifestyle on fertility for both men and women. And I stress the need for both men and women. And the bulk of the guidance deals with general health and well-being, the foundation of healthy relationships, and all aspects of physical, emotional, mental, sexual, and reproductive health and well-being. And also there's a very important reference to the understanding of various forms of sexuality and sexual relationships, so that, to quote, others' families, either in school or in the wider world, may sometimes look different from their own family, but they should respect those differences and know that other children's families are also characterized by love and care. And we stress the emphasis on age-appropriate information, and we have produced validated educational material now for schools that is universally available throughout the UK, with educational material for teachers to deliver these packages of education to their pupils. So does fertility education work? Randomized studies have suggested that individualized counseling and generic education materials may certainly improve fertility knowledge, but perhaps only in the short term, with limited retention of this information, perhaps for as little as 6 months. But then again, I think it depends very much upon how the education materials are delivered, and I'll come on to this in a minute. But there is some evidence that if you provide fertility education, the timing of attempts to conceive may start at an earlier age. And many of you will be familiar with the fertility assessment clinics that have been spearheaded by the team in Copenhagen, Anders Nebo Andersen and his group, and Zoran Ziba, good friends and colleagues over many years, started these fertility assessment clinics, which have been going for a number of years now. The main reason for attending was how long might it be safe to delay parenting, interestingly. An important 8-year follow-up survey of those who had attended was published last year. The response rate was just over a third of the women and about a fifth of the men. 85% of the women had conceived and about 91% of the men had fathered a child. So this might suggest success, but it's a relatively low response rate. And of course, those who attend these clinics are inevitably a self-selected section of the population who may well be better informed and more motivated to understand their reproductive health and make plans based upon the advice that they have received. But nonetheless, the notion of fertility assessment clinics, I think, is a very important one. The question is, can we introduce these sorts of concepts more universally? Now, from the Fertility Education Initiative in the UK, we and others linked in with colleagues initially initiated through ESHRA, and now this international reproductive health collaboration has been spearheaded by Professor Joyce Harper, and has produced a paper published a year or so back on the principles of fertility education, and I commend you to read this paper. And again, I can't go into all of the recommendations, but the essential philosophy is to ensure that all fertility information is based upon up-to-date and robust evidence. We need to be aware of the variations in different cultures, different societies, different countries that may influence reproductive decision-making, including societal pressure and legislation. But the main focus must be on empowering individuals to make informed decisions so that they make the right reproductive choices. And both health and education professionals need to be trained in the most effective way to communicate these messages. And educational tools need to be age appropriate and tailored to the targeted population. And it's also important to use theory-based interventions because these have been shown to be most effective, and to involve end users, so those who will receive the materials, as co-creators, so that they can be involved in the development of the materials, because then they are more likely to be effective. And understudied populations, including men, single mothers by choice, and the LGBTQ plus population, have to be included in the development of these materials. It's also important to consider literacy levels to ensure accessibility, and there's no doubt that interactive and visually engaging tools are much more effective than just simple, bland, static tools. So this is an algorithm that was published in this paper with the conceptual approaches and strategies in fertility awareness at different stages, from children and adolescents through to adults who want to start a family, those who are actively trying to conceive, and those who are having problems conceiving. So this lends a framework for delivering this sort of information. The other thing as fertility professionals we have to remember is that fertility investigations traditionally have focused simply on the female reproductive tract. Can the sperm reach the egg? Is ovulation taking place? And are the sperm healthy? But it's very important that we consider the interaction of all biological systems. And to quote Grace Dugdale, fertility issues are a red flag for other health problems. And John alluded to this as well. We know in the UK, for example, that many women enter pregnancy with lower levels of nutrients that are required for a healthy pregnancy and a healthy baby, irrespective of their body weight. And a tipping point of nutritional deficiencies not only affects fertility and the chance of conceiving and having a miscarriage, but also may have a profound effect on the future health of the pregnancy and the baby. And we don't tend to test for these factors, and they may have a profound effect on reproductive outcomes. And John also mentioned environmental factors and infertility. Time doesn't allow me to go into any great detail. We held a conference in Leeds 2 or 3 years ago now, entitled Every Breath You Treat, looking at the effect of pollution on all aspects of the life cycle, and in particular on the way that the environment may affect fertility. And of course, there is a huge literature on this now. And last, I'd just like to leave you with some thoughts about how maybe we should be thinking toward the future. In the UK, the current government published a 10-year health plan last year to move from hospital to community, analog to digital, and most importantly, from sickness to prevention. And this paper published in the European Heart Journal last year about the future delivery of medicine states very clearly that we should be moving from chronic disease to chronic health. And we need a cultural revolution in healthcare, starting with the need to commence education on lifestyle and health in schools and community health settings in order to promote a more holistic approach to health across the life course. And this, of course, is more than just reproductive health, but it all feeds into each other. So I commend you to read this paper by Luigi Fontana on lifestyle medicine, trying to integrate with clinical services to produce comprehensive polyclinics so that we can address all aspects of health through the life course. And rather than the very brief consultations that certainly in the UK we currently offer in primary care, we need to look more holistically at the long-term health of our population. And this should be the new paradigm for medicine, integrating science and philosophy. And this is a rather grand statement of Luigi's, but with human and planetary health. And just take a minute to look at this. This is the slide from this paper, the science and philosophy of well-being, not only bodily health with nutrition and diet and exercise, healthy exposure to the sun, mind health, cognitive training, better quality of sleep, mindfulness, meditation, and spiritual health as well, all in order to protect nature and our planet. So I'd like to conclude by acknowledging my colleagues with whom we founded the Fertility Education Initiative, a recent publication outlining the work and the link to our website. And just to stress that I believe we have an imperative to engage all healthcare professionals, educators and policymakers. And it's not just about educating young people in schools. We all need to be cognizant of the notion of improving the reproductive health of our nations in order to prevent the calamitous decline in the population and the future concerns that were so beautifully articulated in John's talk. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to an interesting discussion.
Thank you so much, Adam, with this broad scope on declining fertility. I have one question before we move to the Q&A session. And my question would be, how positive are you that improved fertility education will actually result in changing behavior? You read a lot in the lay press that many women, couples, decide not to have children for geopolitical reasons or concerns about the planet and the environment. Of course, under those circumstances, improved fertility knowledge may not really alter their behavior. So how positive are you that education itself is a key factor in future decisions about reproduction?
Very important question, and I think it's a tough one because I think education is just one part of it, but maybe we should be spinning the education in a way to encourage those people who have these geopolitical concerns to advise them that actually that and one doesn't want to sound over patronizing, and this is how we can be criticized, as you mentioned in
Yes.
your introduction, but to explain how important a responsibility we have for maintaining our population. So we have to spin it in a way that is both based upon evidence and it's a slow burn, I think, and we're just scratching the surface. And of course, when we introduce these topics in schools, we're talking to young people who haven't even begun to think about starting a family. So we need to repeat the message at appropriate times and find ways to do so during university or early years at work, and it needs to be a message that needs to be oft repeated, I would say, but challenging, certainly very challenging.
Thank you so much, Adam. So I would like to welcome also John Aitken to come back and join the general discussion. It is time now, and I would like to invite all who are still attending the meeting. We'll go through the questions already raised, but also feel free to come with more questions along the way. And I'll give the floor to Nick to kick off the general Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, such big questions to address tonight. But perhaps just to kick things off, I've been looking at the questions that have come in from a number of people, including from Sandro Esteves from Brazil, John. And I think, you've painted this slightly worrying picture, I suppose, of ART being part of the solution and being part of the problem as well. And so Sandra asked, how do you see the field addressing the potential disconnect between achieving fertilization on the one hand and perhaps ensuring the biological integrity of gametes? How bleak do you think the situation is? Do you think there's a way forward where we could use ART in a way or adapt ART in a way that it becomes a net solution rather than part of the problem?
Yes. Well, I guess the answer to the question is really a question of scale. We don't want to become so reliant on ART that a sizable proportion of the population is being generated in this way. If that happens, as I mentioned, you start to have an effect on the genetic profile of the population, and fecundity just gets worse. We don't want to get to that point. And I think one of the areas that we need to think about a lot, and I come across this a lot in male infertility, is that we have really stopped asking questions about the etiology of human infertility. And this is a tragedy. For most men, we have no idea. People think, in the literature, it will say, oh, well, roughly half of all infertility is due to the male. In truth, we have no idea at all. That's just based on the semen profile, and the semen profile, as we know, is not a diagnostic tool at all. It's just a descriptive tool. It helps you understand what the symptoms are, but doesn't help you understand the etiology of the disease. And maybe if we became a little bit more concerned about the etiology of the disease rather than just treating its outcome, we might have alternatives to IVF. We don't have to use IVF as a single hammer to hit every single kind of infertility nail. There are more options out there if we bother to look. And I think that's been one of the consequences of the rise of ICSI, is that for andrologists anyway, it's kind of destroyed any interest in trying to understand the etiology of the infertility. And men are looked upon these days as just providers of sperm, not a patient with a potentially treatable disease. And
thank you. And I think another sort of side to this has been put by another of the people joining us tonight has been, the rise of ART as being a means to having a family for the LGBTQ plus community, and for single people. That is also providing a sort of a further growth in the use of this route to fertility, which will also add to this potential impact of lack of selection, because there's a whole group of patients or people who need this approach to actually have their families. So it is going to be very, increasingly pressing, but so important that we recognize this now rather than just assuming this is going to be the solution. I mean, interestingly, in Denmark, where I've worked, many people will be watching. I know there are a number of colleagues from Denmark watching this, where there has recently been a marked increase in the public support for fertility treatment. And you said in your lecture, John, I think that, in Denmark, I think it's around about 10%, might be even getting up to 14% now, I believe, of children are conceived through assisted techniques. And it is quite interesting that some countries, partly for equality of access, but also perhaps as a means of addressing this question, are increasing access to funded IVF. And perhaps it's not necessarily going to be, as you said, the answer.
No, I think a couple of things. I think one of the things that is important is if we're going to use IVF, we do need to try to ensure the quality of the gametes that I use. So I think sperm selection is a key issue there. Most mutations, at least 75% of all de novo mutations are created in the male germline, not the female germline. So ensuring you have good quality spermatozoa is really important in that issue, in that context.
Yeah.
But overall, the more that we can think about the etiology of these conditions and not just use IVF or ICSI as the universal treatment, I think the better able we'll be to address this problem at source and not just treat the symptoms.
Yes, thank you.
If I
Bart,
continue.
Yeah,
sorry.
Bart, please go back.
Yeah, maybe looking at the questions, there are several that relates to what we're discussing right now. So one question is there evidence that the increasing use of ART could have transgenerational effects on reproductive potential in future generations? John, any comment related to this question?
I don't know specific data that would say that. I mean, obviously, it is a logical possibility that if through IVF we are increasing the mutational load in children, then there is the possibility that it will have transgenerational effects. And I think that's what I was kind of alluding to when I said the more we use IVF in one generation, the more we're going to need it in the next.
Exactly.
Because what you are doing with this technology is ensuring that the poor fertility genotypes remain within the population.
Thanks. Adam, you had a comment or question?
Well, yes, again, just on this topic, just thinking about our patients with polycystic ovary syndrome, who we these days see as being a population who have reduced fertility, whereas their genetic profile, we believe, probably historically preserved fertility in times of famine, the so-called thrifty genotype hypothesis. So these are individuals who historically were more fertile. And so this again leads us to consider lifestyle, health, nutrition, and the factors that are more fundamental to basic reproduction, and also remembering that there are other treatments before IVF which are simpler and don't have to rely upon the high technology. And this has obviously been emphasized in the latest guidelines on PCOS and the WHO guideline on the management of infertility that was just recently published, stressing the need that there are many other things that we need to be considering before moving to IVF.
John, one question, because in your lecture you very much focused on the male. So one question is, giving emerging evidence on declining sperm quality, to what extent should male reproductive health be repositioned as a central driver rather than a secondary factor in fertility decline narratives? And if you think that we should, then also I would like you to speculate on what would be the best way to do this.
Oh, wow. These are very deep and big questions. So, I think that the male should at least stand center stage with the female. It takes two to tango, but historically we have put much less effort into trying to understand male infertility than we have female infertility. And my old professor used to say our knowledge of male reproduction is a quarter of a century behind our knowledge of female reproduction. So I certainly think, an increased focus on the male would not be before time. And as I've pointed out, most male infertility is of unknown etiology, probably 75% of it. And there is an issue about disciplines and the disciplines that own male infertility. So in some countries, it will be endocrinologists, and others, it will be obstetricians and gynecologists. Somewhere else, it will be urologists. And in Germany, it will be dermatologists. And the fact is that male infertility is a very complicated condition. It involves many different elements, and it involves different disciplines coming together. One of the major causes of male infertility are varicoceles. But obstetricians and gynecologists who run IVF programs are not so interested in varicoceles, because then they have to hand the patient over to a urologist to do the surgery. And in a way, and I think this reflects something that Adam was saying, we need a more holistic approach to infertility. We need both the male and the female to be standing in the center of the stage and to address both of their issues, because often a failure to conceive is due to contributions from both sides. And
Let me give the floor back to Nick to continue the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Bart. I'd like to sort of take in a slightly different direction now. We've been having some questions coming in more about the societal aspects of this, perhaps rather than the biological ones. And it would seem that, that is just as powerful in terms of part of being the problem and solution as any technology we might want to talk about. And a couple of questions have suggested, could there be room for some optimism here, in the sense that as a species we've encountered over the years quite profound challenges to our very existence, and we all seem to find a way through it, or perhaps a natural balancing, and possibly that what we're going to be called upon now, also with the rise of AI and the implications that has, is just to reframe, how we describe success for us in terms of changing our whole models of pension and developing success and financial success. So I wonder whether, both Adam and John, and indeed Bart, you've given a lot of thought over the last few years writing books and looking at education as to perhaps more the behavioral element of this. That do you see any hope for how we might adjust to this new situation, and what potential benefits might come out of things like AI to try and help us adjust to this new situation, but potentially even correct it? Big question, but it's one that's coming through on the questions here, that yes, ART and the biology is important, but what can we do to change or indeed embrace this issue?
Yeah, can I contribute an answer to that? Because I think this is the big question in many ways. And, I think the fertility crisis that we're discussing here, because we are all interested in human fertility, has many reflections for me with the climate crisis. So we didn't really respond to the climate crisis because we didn't see it happening around us. Our day-to-day lived experience didn't really come up against the issues with the climate. It was too big an issue. We're all dealing with our day-to-day lives. And I see fertility in a very similar way. We won't start to really react to fertility until we experience it in our day-to-day lives. So if fertility rates fall dramatically, certain things are going to happen to society. For one thing, wages should go up because there'll be a shortage in skilled labor. House prices should go down because there is going to be more availability. And those kind of things are going to have an impact on people's day-to-day lived experience, and they'll start to realize that something is actually happening here. If you go to Japan now, you can see nursery schools being closed down before your very eyes, and you can see nursing homes being created. That tells you that something is happening to society. And we need those kind of things to impact upon us before we start to do something about it. And we can do something about it. I don't think this is, I definitely wouldn't want to paint a doom-laden scenario for the future. I'm sure we can get out of this. But we have to, realize that something is happening. Unfortunately, both climate change and fertility change take place in a time scale which is longer than our attention span, which is a sort of political cycle of 3 to 5 years. The changes we're talking about are going to take place over decades and centuries. And that's quite difficult for people to relate to.
Thank you. Yes. Adam, do you want to go maybe and then Bart?
Yes, I mean, I think as far as, I mean, AI has positives as well as potential dangers. I mean, someone in Google knows exactly what we're doing, when we're doing it, what we're wanting to buy, where we're going to go on holiday. And if you look for a washing machine online, as we all know, for the next several months, you get sent lots of adverts for washing machines. But it can be used in a positive way to send out messages about fertility, education, these sorts of things. If done in a sensitive way. Everybody has apps these days that tells them about their daily lives, and potentially these can be used in a positive way. And it's not only about sort of education in the sort of the, if you like, the sort of the forum of schools and biology. It can be in the context of the arts, drama, TV series, and there are lots of ways of getting messages out about the impact of infertility and the importance of reproductive health that can be done in a more positive way. It's a question of harnessing the power that we have with all aspects of modern communication, which I think perhaps we're not as savvy about as we could be.
Thank you. Bart.
Yeah, if I may, I would like to propose that we move to Adam's lecture and address some of the questions, and then maybe later on we can bring both presentations together. I see some, for me, intriguing questions. Maybe the first one: what are your views, Adam, on at-home fertility testing, especially focusing on AMH, and should these even be advertised as fertility tests? Your holistic view, please.
You can look at this in two ways. As long as they are validated tests, it's not just about AMH. I mean, people do home sperm tests, and some of which have been validated and may have a role. But I suppose it's not a bad idea to encourage people, again, to be empowered with the tools to ensure that they have knowledge about their own reproductive health. I would argue that it would be preferable to make sure that we have appropriately trained professionals who are helping people interpret the results of any testing that's done. And
because are you convinced that the current available tests give robust enough information that people can rely on?
I think some can, and some do, and some don't. I mean, it is the technology has advanced hugely, so I wouldn't dismiss them all without having any role at all. But I think there are many people who don't have many people who are promoting some of these assessments who may not have the basic scientific and medical knowledge to be able to support people to both interpret the results and know what they need to do with them. And so that's why the validated fertility assessment clinics along the lines of those in Copenhagen are obviously much more, dare I say, professionally based. But I'm certainly not opposed to people having the opportunity to do their own assessments if they so wish. Just they need to have the right information to know what it means.
Another question, to what extent do IVF clinics, through the commercial promotion of elective egg freezing, contribute to the broader society trends in declining fertility rates?
Well, again, you could look at that in two ways, because some people have argued that all young people should freeze eggs and sperm when they are genetically more normal. But that is pushing people down a very high-tech avenue, and probably isn't what most of us would like to see for our society. And again, egg freezing, as we know, isn't a guarantee of a future child, but young eggs are more likely to lead to healthy pregnancies. So it's a really difficult one, because we all know, big commercial organizations who have offered egg freezing, probably rather cynically, to their young female population so that they can squeeze the lifeblood out of them whilst they're working, and with the sometimes false promise of a baby when they want it later. And of course it's highly commercialized as well. And if we could remove the commerce from fertility healthcare, then I think that we would live in a much more comfortable world.
Thanks. There's more, but maybe Nick, you first. Do you have some issues you would like to raise?
There's a whole range of questions coming in. I mean, we haven't touched on the biological environmental factors. They've been listed as another part of the perfect storm, alongside societal changes, behavioral changes, potential role of ART, and then there are these. I suppose it comes back to this question of optimism. Do you feel that, having named the problem and identified them, that it does give us a route map to try and address them? For instance, if we think about environmental factors out there, are there any hopes for optimism on that front? I'm trying to see if we can start looking towards some solutions.
Of course, so first of all, I think the evidence that these kind of environmental factors, I saw in the questions people have asked about microplastics and
yes,
and so PFAS compounds and so on, forever chemicals. The animal data that suggests that these compounds are capable of having impacts on fertility is incontrovertible. They certainly are out there, and they can certainly have an impact. The problem for us, I think, is making that transition between animal data and human data, because humans are not exposed to large doses of single pollutants at a time, but to a very complex mixture of low-dose pollutants, and we need to understand what those mixtures are. So something I've advocated a lot is, a multidisciplinary approach to this whole thing. And we need to involve chemists. You need a lot more mass spectrometry to try to understand what levels of pollution are we actually looking at here. And people are beginning to do this now, look at pollutants in seminal plasma, in follicular fluid, in blood. How much of what kind are these pollutants? And can we reconvene the animal experiments to make them a bit more realistic, so we have a realistic view of whether this is important? In the overall question of optimism, of course, I think we should be very optimistic that once we understand the problem, we can resolve it.
Yeah.
And the only way that that would not be the case would be if the things that we are doing now are left unattended to the point where human fecundity starts to decline.
Right.
When that starts to happen, then our capacity to get out of the trough that we found ourselves in becomes much more difficult. And I think a real key question for reproductive biologists and fertility specialists is fecundity actually declining? And if so, what would be the evidence that would convince you that that is actually the case? People turn to things like falling sperm counts and falling abortion levels, falling adoption levels as being evidence that fecundity is declining, but all this data is a bit soft. What are the criteria by which we would determine whether human fecundity is actually falling and what the causes are? So fertility is the output measure that's easy to measure. But what's much more difficult is to look at our fundamental capacity to reproduce and therefore the reasons to be cheerful or not as we look forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, a question actually for both the speakers, maybe first Adam and then John, because I think is a very fundamental issue. How should we perceive falling fertility rates? What we now often do is focus on the pension and workforce crisis, but we could also accept it, embrace it, look at this as an opportunity to rethink our economic system, retirement system, family, work, community. So go one way or the other, or should we combine them? Maybe Adam, you go first, because that's what I hear often in the conversations that I have with journalists and the lay press.
Yes, I mean, it's this whole notion of ensuring that we have a sort of a pro-natalist approach to society, I think, isn't it? But also supporting young people to start families when the time is right. But we do see, big economic pressures. We see retirement ages and pension ages increasing. So I think we're going the wrong way, really. We should be trying to help our younger population to start a family and develop their careers and help with housing and all of the things that are important for society, and provide more support at the younger age, because that will pay dividends for helping the elderly population in the future.
Yeah, maybe I can come in, Bart. I've just noticed on that point that Mina Alikani has come in with a comment on that, which she says she quotes the UNFPA to express her own concern, and it's probably articulates what you've said, Adam, that this crisis is not rooted in individual reproductive decisions that fail to align with the needs of the state or economy. Rather, it is a crisis rooted in environments and policy choices that are misaligned with the desires of individuals, which have failed to create the economic security and personal empowerment that people say are preconditions for realizing their family formation goals, which sort of turns it on its head. So rather than the government's, I think the French government's been writing to people this week saying, get on and have your family. It should be going the other direction. How do you feel about that?
I think so it is inevitable now that the human population will fall. It's not going to fall tomorrow. It's not even going to fall in the next decade. In fact, for the next 2 decades, it's going to continue to grow globally.
Yep.
But in some parts of the world where there is a combination of low fertility and mass emigration, and there are some countries in Eastern Europe that fall into this category, they are rapidly depopulating. And this, will have an impact on people's lifestyle and the way that we construct society. I think what we would all like to do is to try to develop systems that give us some level of stability, so we don't have to worry about population decline. And that will require all the things that we've talked about. It will require better education, better knowledge of environmental and lifestyle factors. And yes, I think society will have to adjust. But if we do nothing, then if the global fertility rate is 1, then in every generation it's going to be halving. And there is no floor here, which just keeps on halving until we get to very, very low numbers where it becomes unsustainable. But this, again, this is taking place over decades and centuries. This is not something that we have to worry about now. But it's interesting to contemplate what the future will be like. And people talk about the great simplification, how we're going to have to get used to a lifestyle that is much simpler than the one that we have now, where the emphasis is truly on sustainable things, not the consumer society that we currently have.
Okay, well, thank you, John. Bart, is there anything else you want to come in? I think that's a really great moment on which to end the discussion.
Yeah, well, I think so too.
Well, look, I think we could have quite happily sort of discussed this for far longer, and it's been a real pleasure to have our speakers with us this evening, bringing their respective expertise and experience to this fascinating problem. So I'd like to bring the session to a close. And I thank you all, of course, for joining us this evening or today. We've had a terrific number of you listening in and participating in the discussion. And I'd like to thank, of course, our speakers, John Aitken and Adam Balen, of course, Bart Fauser as well for co-chairing this evening, and to hand over to Bart now to close the session.
Thank you so much. I hope for all of you, dear colleagues, I still see that hundreds and hundreds attending. Thank you for participating in the discussion and raising questions. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as I did. And thank you, Nick, for hosting all of us, including me. And I would also like to thank the organizers, the I3 Organization Committee, Shaq Cohen, Peter Nagy, Marianne Svetzek, Thomas Elliott, Fran Farley, Violet Sora, and Charles Palmer. And I would like to end with drawing your attention for the next I3 RBMO session, which will be very soon, March 31, with a totally different focus, which will be cell imaging and new ways to study cell and embryo development. So again, food for thought, and thank you very much, speakers and attendees and I3 people for joining us today. Thank you. Goodbye. Have a great day.